So now we have all of our iSCSI configuration policies and settings in place. Now we just have to go into the service profile itself, add those settings and add those configurations into the service profile. That enables the server, when it comes online, to reach across the network and do an iSCSI boot. By the end of this nugget, we will understand exactly how to configure iSCSI boot from start to finish. The remainder of our iSCSI boot configuration needs to be done within the service profile itself. So we're going to create this service profile, and we'll give it a name. We're just going to call this temp example. And we're going to skip straight over to the networking. So given a typical service profile configuration, we're going to come to this LAN connectivity, switch over to expert, and this is where we would add all of our VNICs. So we would have VNICs for things like data, live migration traffic, DMZ, and iSCSI. So we're going to go ahead and create 2 VNICs for iSCSI. We're going to get through this pretty quickly. So we're going to call them iSCSI 0, and we'll use the template that we've created for iSCSI on Fabric A. Hit OK. And we're going to add iSCSI 1 that will use the VNIC template for iSCSI-B. And we'll say OK there. So now we come down and we can add iSCSI VNICs. Again, these VNICs are only going to be used in the case of iSCSI boot. We will not use these as part of our hypervisor. Our hypervisor won't see the iSCSI VNICs. These are going to be the overlay VNICs that we talked about in the last nugget that will go over the 2 VNICs that we just created. So we can add a VNIC name, and keeping in mind we want to match the policy that we just made. So in the previous nugget, it was iSCSI boot 0 and iSCSI boot 1. In your environment, call it whatever you want. Just make sure you have it documented. So the overlay VNIC that we're choosing to put this over is iSCSI 0. This is our Fabric A VNIC. And from here, we can select the VLAN. Now, it has to be the native VLAN. If we're carrying multiple iSCSI VLANs, make sure that we're picking the native VLAN. Fortunately, it tells us which one the native is here. And MAC address assignment. So this is very important. We do not change this setting. So even though it allows us to set a MAC address, and it looks like by all rights we should, and say, okay, this is Fabric A, we should go with MAC address A, but it borrows the MAC address from the other VNIC, the one that we're overlaying, and so we don't actually need a MAC address. In fact, selecting a MAC address can cause problems during the iSCSI boot process. So we say OK, and we add our second one, and we say iSCSI boot 1, and the overlay VNIC in this case would be iSCSI 1. The VLAN has already been set, 15 native, and we don't change the MAC address, and we say OK. And now we have our 2 iSCSI VNICs configured as well. The next step is to configure the boot order settings. So on server boot order, we'll come here and we'll select the iSCSI boot that we had created. And down here, we actually have to expand this and select the individual VNICs, the iSCSI VNICs, specifically iSCSI boot 0 and iSCSI boot 1 that we had configured. So I expand this for a second. There we go. So iSCSI boot 0, and this option right here is highlighted. Now, we pointed out in a previous nugget that if for any reason this is grayed out, chances are that the iSCSI boot name here, and this was not configured in the service profile, by the way. This is part of the boot policy that we configured prior to this. So if this name here doesn't match back on our networking tab, the names that we created down here, iSCSI boot 0 and iSCSI boot 1, if those names don't match, then we're going to have a problem. This will not light up. So if you don't have this as an option, double check that your name matches what you put in to the networking section here. So we can come here and go to set iSCSI boot parameters, and this is where we configure what exactly happens on boot. So the first order of business is to give it the name assignment, and we configured this as part of a previous nugget, the creating the IQN and IP pools. In fact, we're going to take the IQN pool here. It will derive an IQN from that pool. And the IP address too, we can't leave it DHCP. Most environments don't have DHCP in the data center, and certainly not on the iSCSI network. So we want to give it an IP address, and we can take it from the iSCSI initiator pool. And it shows up as all zeros here, no worries. That's because it has yet to pull an IP address from the pool. Once we create the service profile, we can see which IP address has been assigned. Now we want to add the storage array target. So we click add, and the name here, by the way, this is not an arbitrary name. This is the IQN of the storage array that's in our environment. So as part of this example, I'm going to make something up, but when you're configuring this in production, you have to get onto the storage array and find out what its IQN is. In the same way we need to find out what its IP address is for the section right here. We need to find out exactly what its IP address is. So IQN, I'm just going to make something up here, 2008-12.com.array, :1. So there we go. I've made something up. Again, this should be taken straight from your storage array. Chances are the port for iSCSI 3260 won't be changed, but again, consult with your storage array vendor. The IP address would be the IP address of my array. So I'm going to call it 192.168. It's VLAN 15 in our made-up example here. So I'm going to call this .50. The LUN ID would also be taken from your storage array if for any reason it's not 0. A lot of them are 0, but I've certainly seen where sometimes they're 1 or 2. So if you're having problems connecting, you might just have the wrong LUN ID. So we say OK, but here's the thing. We actually want to create a second connection. So most of the time, and this should be the same thing if I can remember exactly what I said here. I think I said 2008-12.com.array : 1. And the IP address would be the other NIC. So in our case, .15.50 I'd said, we'll say .51. LUN ID would be the same. So this gives me connectivity to the different, let's see if I got that. Oh, I did. I got that the same. That's great. So I'm connecting to my imaginary storage array across the network on 2 different connections. This allows, in case the NIC on the storage array goes down, that I don't have to completely switch over to the other fabric. So again, we have maximum of 2 allowed. I can't add any more. This is great. We can say OK. And from here, we do the same thing with iSCSI boot 1. Set boot parameters. And we're going to go through the same process. I won't go into all of the details because we've already done this once. But we pick our pools. We add it. We add exactly what that, whatever that was, iqn.2008.12.com.array : 1. Because it should be the same between the 2 fabrics. And then the IP addresses would also, in all likelihood, be the same. But again, mileage may vary depending on what storage array you have in your environment. So we can say OK. We would add the second one for sure. We're going to cancel out, or we'll just say OK here. And now we've configured, ideally, all 4 of our connections through the iSCSI network to the storage array so that we can have an iSCSI boot process. So that's it. Now we know how to configure iSCSI boot, going all the way back to when we created those IQN and IP address pools, followed by creating the boot policy itself, remembering that we have to put that very important name. We have to make sure we replicate that to this nugget, which is when we go into the service profile, create the iSCSI VNICs, and apply the configuration policies against them within the boot policy itself. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.